Greetings, humans of the internet, and welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from an undisclosed location in Midwest USA. And since St. Patrick's Day was last Tuesday, I figured it would be a good time to discuss the history of the holiday, because it would be a great travesty to my fellow Americans of Irish descent to completely glaze over the history of St. Patrick's Day celebrations in America, because it is quite a story, if I do say so myself. So please join me as I dive into the history of St. Patrick's Day. Now, St. Patrick honors Ireland's patron saint, well, St. Patrick. The holiday is celebrated on March 17th, which was the anniversary of his death in the 5th century. So needless to say, St. Patrick's Day goes back over 1,000 years. And although it is largely a secular holiday today, the origin of St. Patrick's Day is of course religious, as you could probably tell by the name. Ancient Christians in Ireland began observing a feast day for St. Patrick around the 9th and 10th centuries. And on the holiday, which usually fell during the Lenten season, Irish families traditionally attended church in the morning and celebrated in the afternoon. Lenten prohibitions against the consumption of meat were waived, and people danced, drank, and feasted on the customary meal of Irish bacon, not beef, and cabbage, to celebrate the life of a most remarkable man. St. Patrick was not born in Ireland, and in fact his name was not Patrick. His name was Maewyn Succat. And historical sources suggest he was born in Roman Britain in the late 4th century. As a teenager, he was captured by Irish traders and taken to Ireland as a slave. And during this period of captivity, he worked as a shepherd and experienced a profound religious awakening. Years later, he escaped slavery and returned to Great Britain. According to his own writings, he later experienced a vision calling him back to Ireland. He returned as a Christian missionary and spent much of his time converting Irish communities to Christianity. The two earlier surviving texts attributed to St. Patrick help historians understand his life: the Confessio, which was a spiritual biography describing his faith and missionary work, and Letters to Coroticus, a message condemning the enslavement of Christian converts. And although details of his life are debated, his influence on Irish Christianity became legendary. Over time, he came to be honored as the patron saint of Ireland. And St. Patrick is also recognized as the originator of some important Irish symbols. For example, the shamrock, which he used to teach the Trinity, because while the shamrock has 3 leaves, it is still one plant, showing that God exists in 3 forms: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But anyway, back to the history. Evidence shows that the first St. Patrick's Day parade was not held in Ireland, but in North America. Records show that a St. Patrick's Day parade was held on March 17, 1601 in the Spanish colony of St. Augustine, Florida. The parade was organized by the Spanish colony's Irish vicar, Ricardo Artur. Interestingly, Boston, Massachusetts has also claimed that they originated the St. Patrick's Day parade on March 17, 1737, when more than 24 Presbyterians who immigrated Northern Ireland gathered to honor St. Patrick and formed the Charitable Irish Society to assist distressed Irishmen in the city. The oldest Irish organization in America still holds an annual dinner every St. Patrick's Day. Ironically, it was the Redcoats who started the tradition of America's longest and largest St. Patrick's Day parade in 1762, when Irish soldiers who served in the British Army marched through Lower Manhattan to a St. Patrick's Day breakfast at a local tavern. The March 17th parades by the Irish through the streets of New York City angered nativist anti-Catholic mobs who started their own tradition of Paddy making on the eve of St. Patrick's Day by creating effigies of Irishmen wearing rags and necklaces of potatoes with whiskey bottles in their hands, until the practice was ultimately banned in 1803. And this should come as no surprise, but we have the Great Potato Famine to thank for many of the St. Patrick's Day traditions that we hold near and dear to our hearts today. After hordes and hordes of Irish immigrants flooded into the United States following the Great Potato Famine in 1845, they clung to their Irish identities and took to the streets in St. Patrick's Day parades to show their strength in numbers as a political retort to the nativist Know-Nothing Party, about which I talked in the first ever episode of Bowtie Talks. Mike McCormick, the former national historian for the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which is the oldest American Catholic fraternal organization, stated, "Many who were forced to leave Ireland during the Great Hunger brought a lot of memories, but they didn't have their country, so it was a celebration of being Irish. But there was also a bit of defiance because of the bigotry by the Know-Nothings against them." However, McCormick later said that attitudes toward the Irish began to soften after tens of thousands of them served in the Civil War. "They went out as second-class citizens, but came back as heroes," he said. And as the Irish slowly began to assimilate into American culture, people without one drop of Celtic blood began to join in St. Patrick's Day celebrations. Now that we've already covered the parades, I think it's time we head over to the foods. And I'm about to pull out the rug from underneath you people, but believe it or not, corned beef and cabbage on St. Patrick's Day is not actually Irish. For many, many years, beef was not at all very popular in Ireland. From early on, cattle in Ireland were not raised for meat, but rather as work animals and for their milk. Now, salted beef in and of itself does have roots in Ireland. Early on, beef was seen as a commodity afforded only by the very wealthy. Cattle were originally only killed for their meat if the cows were too old to work or produce milk. In these early times, the beef was salted to be preserved. However, the first salted beef in Ireland was not actually made with salt, but with sea ash, which is a product of burning seaweed. A 12th century poem showed that salted beef was eaten by the kings. The poem is one of the greatest parodies in the Irish language and pokes fun at the diet of King Cathail MacFinnigan, an early Irish king, who is depicted as having a demon of gluttony stuck in his throat, and it reads as follows. "Wheatlet, son of Micklet, son of juicy bacon, is my known name. Honey buttered roll is this man's that bears my bag. Haunch of mutton is my dog's name. Of lovely leaps, lard my wife, Sleetly smiles across the hilltop. Cheese curds my daughter, goes around the spit. Fair is her fame. Corned beef my son, whose mantle shines over a big tail." And as the poem mentions, pork was also eaten, and pigs were the most prevalent animal bred only to be eaten from ancient times to today, and pork was seen as the everyman's meal in Ireland. And the Irish diet stayed pretty much the same until England conquered most of the country. The British were the ones who changed the cow into a commodity, fueled beef production, and also introduced the potato. The British had a beef-eating culture since the invasion of the Roman armies. England had to outsource to Ireland, Scotland, and eventually North America to satisfy the growing palate of its people. Herds of cattle were exported by the tens of thousands each year from Ireland to England. The Cattle Acts of 1663 and 1667 were what fueled the Irish corned beef industry, however. These acts prohibited the export of live cattle to England, which drastically flooded the Irish market and lowered the cost of meat available for salted beef production. And it should be noted that it was the British who coined the term corned beef. And actually, corned beef has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with corn. The term was invented to describe the salt crystals used to cure the meat, which resembled corn kernels. And after the Cattle Acts, salt was the main reason Ireland became the hub for corned beef. Ireland's salt tax was almost 1/10 that of England's, and the Irish could import the highest quality salt at a reasonable price. Ironically, the ones producing the beef could not afford beef or corned beef for themselves. When England conquered Ireland, oppressive laws against the Irish began. Their land was taken away from them, and plantations were set up. If the Irish could afford any meat at all, as previously stated, pork was what was eaten. So I guess you could say pork. It's what's for dinner. Or should I say, pork! It's what's for dinner! But the potato is really what the Irish relied on. Now, as I talked about before in the first episode of Bowtie Talks, the potato famine forced thousands upon thousands, perhaps even millions of Irish people out of their homeland into America. And in America, the Irish were once again faced with the challenges of prejudice. To make life easier for themselves, they settled together in mostly urban areas, with the largest numbers being in New York City. Meanwhile, they were making more money than they had in Ireland under the rule of the British. With more money for food, the Irish could afford meat for the first time ever. But they found in a bizarre twist that pork was very expensive and thus only afforded by the very wealthy, while beef was considered the everyman's meal. So they switched from something that oinks to something that moos. And the beef they could afford just so happened to be corned beef. The Irish immigrants bought their meat mostly from kosher butchers. And what we think of today as corned beef is usually Jewish corned beef thrown in a pot with cabbage and potatoes. The corned beef they found was very different than the corned beef that was made in the native Ireland. Jewish corned beef is made from brisket, while the Irish corned beef was basically any part of the cow packed in salt. And as a result, Irish corned beef was more salt than beef probably, as it was known to taste more like salt than actual beef. The corned beef that they found was from brisket, a kosher cut of meat from the front of the cow. And since brisket is a tougher cut of meat, the salting and curing process transformed the meat into the extremely tender, flavorful corned beef we know today. So the Irish Americans transformed a feast day honoring the patron saint of Ireland to a celebration of their heritage and their homeland. With the celebration became a meal. And in honor of their culture, the immigrants splurged on the neighbors' corned beef, which was accompanied by their beloved potato and the most readily available vegetable, the cabbage. And so we have two cultures coming together to make something new. And it didn't take long for corned beef and cabbage to become associated with St. Patrick's Day. However, the popularity of corned beef and cabbage never caught on across the pond in Ireland, and to this day, the traditional St. Patrick's Day meal remains ham or bacon. Another popular St. Patrick's Day tradition for the folks in Illinois, of course, is the annual dyeing of the Chicago River green. Believe it or not, inspiration struck when someone noticed a plumber's overalls were spotted green. It happened in 1961 when a man named Stephen Bailey, who was the business manager for the Chicago Journeyman Plumbers local union, noticed that a plumber's white overalls had bright green stains on them, which matched the emerald color often associated with Ireland. The green dye was used to help to clean up the river's waterfront areas. And when Richard J. Daley became mayor of Chicago in 1955, he endeavored to discover where the sewage in the water was originating. The green dye was used to help identify the source of leaky pipes. And then in 1962, the local plumbers union decided to use 100 pounds of that dye in the river to turn it green for St. Patrick's Day. And it stayed that way for a week. Originally, though, Daley wanted to use the green dye to dye a section of Lake Michigan bright green, until he was persuaded to dye the much more manageable Chicago River bright green instead. However, much has changed since 1961. For one thing, the dye has been changed from an oil-based dye to a more environmentally friendly powdered vegetable-based dye. And the amount of dye in the river has changed as well, and so the color only lasts for a few hours rather than an entire week. Another great St. Patrick's Day tradition, of course, is drinking green beer. And interestingly, the possible origins of this are well known. It's been said that green beer was first introduced in 1914 for a St. Patrick's Day dinner at the Schnurrer Club in New York City. A man named Dr. Thomas H. Curtin decided the best way to make his event more festive would be to make absolutely everything green, including his beer. Where Curtin may have got the idea for his green beer may have came from the other side of the country in Spokane, Washington. An article dated March 17, 1910, divulged the news of a bar on First Avenue in Spokane, Washington that was serving green beer. However, the bartender would not share how he dyed his concoction. And interestingly, although the color green is now an icon of Ireland, that was not always so. It happened during the 17th century when the color became a symbol of unity for Irish Catholics in their struggle against oppressive English rule. It was very important to distinguish between Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants in the country, where Catholics were represented in green and Protestants were represented in orange. Green was also worn to go against the British blue, and there you have it. Another thing I think I should clear up is the spelling of St. Paddy's Day. The proper spelling is Paddy for Paddy. Paddy is the nickname for Patrick in Ireland, while Patty is a girl's name. And so there you have it. It's Paddy's Day, not Patty's Day. And with that, folks, I'm afraid I have to leave you now. I've got some shamrocks to tend to, is what I would say if I actually had some shamrocks. But I don't. Although I do like shamrocks, they're the national flower of Ireland. And I think we've learned today that America is most definitely a melting pot. After all, if it had not been for the Irish and the Jewish people living in such close proximity to each other, we may have never had corned beef and cabbage. I think we've also learned that the Irish have made an indelible mark upon America. And with that, I say goodbye, God bless, and Aaron go bragh!